Welcome to the Deep Sleep Library. Before we begin, take a deep breath, let the day go, and settle in. If you enjoy these slow journeys into the past, remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us bring you more calm, cozy history to drift away to. Tonight, our candlelight story begins in the heart of the medieval city, a world of stone walls, wooden roofs, and cobblestone streets that echoed with the clatter of horses and the hum of trade. The medieval world, for all its grandeur and mystery, was not exactly fragrant. Between the mud, the tanneries, and the enthusiastic lack of plumbing, cities were a patchwork of beauty and chaos. But amid the noise of the market and the clang of the church bell, there existed another layer of life, quieter, secretive, and surprisingly organized. These were the brothels, not quite hidden, not quite respected, yet undeniably woven into the rhythm of medieval life. The streets are dim, the sky a soft violet fading into black. Candles flicker from wooden windows, and in the distance, a church bell tolls. You might expect quiet reflection and prayer, but down a narrow side street, where laughter mingles with music and a faint smell of roasted meat drifts through the air, another kind of establishment is waking up. This isn't the scandalous chaos one might imagine. No, the medieval brothel was, in many places, an official part of the city, legal, taxed, and sometimes even approved by the local bishop. Strange, isn't it? A society that built cathedrals of breathtaking beauty also built what they called houses of comfort, the city as a living organism. To understand why, we have to step back and see the city itself. Medieval cities were like living organisms, bustling, breathing, and constantly expanding. The walls kept out invaders but also kept people packed in tight. Trade flourished, merchants grew rich, and workers poured in from the countryside seeking opportunity or survival. And with crowds came everything that crowds bring: good intentions, bad habits, loneliness, and desire. The city was a paradox, deeply religious yet painfully human. For every cathedral there was a tavern, for every monastery a market, and for every sermon about sin there was a street corner that quietly ignored it. The role of worldly houses, brothels, or as medieval officials preferred to call them, public houses of women, were part of a delicate balance. They were tolerated because, according to the logic of the time, better to confine sin than let it roam free. The church preached purity, yes, but even theologians admitted that people were people. St. Augustine himself once remarked that if you eliminated prostitutes, the world might fall into greater chaos. And so, cities began to regulate the necessary evil. Brothels were taxed, inspected, and oddly enough, sometimes protected by law. It was not about celebration, but about control. Think of it like medieval crowd management. Life around the corners. These districts were often placed outside the main city walls, or just near the river, convenient but out of respectable sight. In London, that district was Southwark across the Thames. In Paris, it was Rue Saint-Denis and La Cite's darker alleys. In Florence, they were tucked behind bathhouses and wine taverns. They were not always grim. Some resembled lively inns, with music, dancing, and chatter. The kind of place where weary travelers could sit by a fire, share a drink, and forget the world for an hour or two. If you walked past, you might hear laughter, a lute playing softly, or see shadows moving behind colored shutters. The atmosphere was closer to a tavern than a scandal, at least until curfew bells rang and the city's night watch made their rounds. ensuring all was mostly quiet. A strange kind of order. In a world where almost everything was dictated by religion and rank, brothels existed as strange pockets of freedom, though not necessarily joyful ones. Rules governed who could enter, what could be worn, and when doors must close. A madam or keeper, often a retired worker, oversaw the place with a sharp eye and a ledger. And of course, the city took its share through taxes, ensuring sin also served the state's finances. In many cities, brothels even had official hours, color-coded attire, and curfews, as if sin, too, could be scheduled like market day. Between shadows and candles, the irony of medieval life was that it embraced contradiction. The same person who might attend Mass in the morning could stroll through the less holy quarters at dusk without much surprise. And yet, these places weren't just about desire. They became gathering spots, rumor mills, and even early forms of entertainment houses. Minstrels performed there, travelers shared tales, and gossip from nobles to peasants trickled through these dimly lit rooms like spilled wine. So as our candle burns low and the city quiets for the night, imagine standing at the edge of that world, where morality and humanity blended in the flicker of torchlight. In this curious balance between faith and flesh, medieval towns found a way to manage their contradictions, not by erasing them, but by giving them an address. And so, as we leave the cobbled streets behind for now, we step into the next part of our journey, where we'll see how these houses were legalized, taxed, and strangely enough, sometimes blessed by law itself. Chapter 2: Licensed Houses, Legal Sin. The medieval mind was many things, devout, practical, and wonderfully contradictory. It could build soaring cathedrals to glorify the heavens, and, at the same time, draft very precise municipal regulations about what time a brothel could open on Thursdays. Yes, welcome to the logic of the Middle Ages. The birth of legal sin. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Europe's cities were growing restless and crowded. With merchants, mercenaries, sailors, and pilgrims constantly passing through, temptation wasn't exactly hard to find. Authorities realized that outlawing vice entirely was like trying to stop the rain, possible only in sermons. So they took a more practical route. They licensed it. It sounds strange to modern ears, but in many towns, brothels were as official as bakeries, though considerably less well advertised. The civic logic. City councils argued that controlled immorality was better than chaos. If people were going to sin anyway, better they do it under supervision in one district during fixed hours with taxes collected and rules posted. That's medieval bureaucracy for you. Order in everything, even indulgence. For example, in London, the famous district of Southwark, across the Thames from the city, was directly under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Winchester. This made the establishments their technically church property. Imagine that. The church didn't run the brothels, but it did own the land they stood on. And yes, they collected rent. Those women who worked there were even nicknamed Winchester geese. Not because they were graceful, but because, like the birds, they were officially counted and taxed. Rules of the game. In Paris, the system was even more meticulous. City records from the 14th century describe houses that had to be marked with special signs, a small lantern or a painted symbol, so that customers knew which doors were legal. Brothel owners were forbidden from operating too close to churches, schools, or noble residences, and workers were not allowed to wear respectable colors. No velvet, no fur, and definitely no jewels. Instead, they were often required to wear plain dresses, sometimes with stripes or distinctive sleeves, marking their status. A strange combination of shame and regulation, sin with an instruction manual, taxes and permissions. Most cities imposed a vice tax, a modest fee collected weekly or monthly. In some places, part of that income went directly to public works, road repairs, bridge maintenance, or even hospitals. So, in an odd way, one might say that medieval brothels helped pave the streets. Licenses were often granted to widows or older women, not out of kindness, but because the city believed they would be less tempted to sin themselves and more reliable as keepers. These women, known as abbesses of love, managed the premises, enforced curfews, and kept peace among both guests and workers. Their role was half landlady, half peacekeeper, and occasionally part-time confessor. Strange but true regulations. Records from Florence, Venice, and Nuremberg show how organized things could get. In some cities, only certain days were allowed for opening. In others, officials visited monthly to inspect hygiene and safety, yes, even in the 1300s. In Nuremberg, a city ordinance stated that men who visited the official brothel could not spend more than a set amount, nor stay the entire night. A curfew for sinning. Meanwhile, in Avignon, the papal city itself, brothels were tolerated so long as they remained discreet and the workers attended Mass on Sundays. That's medieval moral multitasking, the moral reasoning. Behind all this, of course, was a peculiar kind of logic. Church leaders argued that prostitution acted as a safety valve, preventing greater evils like adultery or violence. Better to have sin confined to a house, they said, than running rampant through the city. St. Thomas Aquinas himself compared brothels to the sewers of a palace. Unpleasant, yes, but necessary for the rest of the structure to remain clean. A poetic metaphor, though perhaps not one anyone wanted to test literally. Community and compromise. This odd balance between morality and tolerance meant that the medieval brothel wasn't a secret den of darkness. It was an open secret, existing in plain sight but wrapped in polite silence. Neighbors might frown, priests might preach, but business went on, because everyone quietly knew that the system kept the peace. It was hypocrisy perhaps, but also a form of harmony. In a world constantly struggling between the sacred and the human, it was one of many compromises that kept society functioning. The human side. And while these licensed houses might sound coldly bureaucratic, within their wooden walls were people. Tired, funny, flawed, and real. The women who lived there had their own rules, friendships, and small rebellions. They decorated their rooms with flowers, hung bits of bright cloth, and sometimes even kept pets. Small signs of comfort in a world that often judged them harshly. Their stories, the laughter, the tragedies, and the whispered gossip deserve their own chapter. And that, dear listener, is exactly where we'll go next. So as the candlelight dims and the hum of the medieval streets fades into the night, imagine these small houses, the windows aglow, the laughter gentle, the city at uneasy peace with its own contradictions. The bells toll midnight, the law sleeps, but the world behind the shutters stays quietly alive. Chapter 3, What They Looked Like. If you could step through time, past the clatter of carts and the clang of blacksmiths, and walk quietly into a medieval town at dusk, you might not immediately spot a brothel. It wouldn't look like a place of scandal or glamour. It would look, for the most part, quite ordinary. And that's the first surprise. Medieval brothels weren't painted in bright colors or covered in signs. Most looked like any other two-story wooden house, tucked between taverns, stables, or small workshops. No neon lights, no velvet curtains. Just a wooden door, a faint smell of smoke and herbs, and a flickering lamp by the window. The outside. Most brothels were built of timber and wattle, with a steep, tiled or thatched roof and a small wooden sign. Sometimes that sign was as subtle as a painted lantern or a carved figure. A dove, a rose, or even a pair of gloves. These symbols were quiet codes, familiar to locals but unnoticed by the church's more respectable eyes. In licensed districts, brothels stood close together, their upper stories leaning almost toward each other across narrow lanes, as if whispering secrets through the dark. The smell of baked bread from a nearby tavern mixed with perfume and the unmistakable medieval air. A cocktail of humanity, smoke, and a touch of mystery. The entrance. Stepping inside, you'd be greeted by warmth, the crackle of a fire, and maybe a faint tune played on a lute or hurdy-gurdy. The air was heavy with the scent of tallow candles. Herbs hung to mask less pleasant odors, and perhaps rosewater if the house was prosperous. A keeper or madam usually sat near the door, keeping careful watch. She wasn't just a hostess. She was the rule enforcer, accountant, and sometimes moral philosopher of the house. Pay your coin, mind your manners, and no fighting was a standard policy, though probably delivered with less poetry. The common room. The front room was often a gathering space, more tavern than temple of sin. There might be a rough wooden table, a few stools, and a fire burning low. Visitors could drink watered wine or ale, talk, sing, and forget the cold for a while. On busier nights, laughter echoed off the beams, mingling with the clinking of cups and the strumming of a tune. And yet, everything remained strangely subdued, not wild, but weary, like people trying to warm themselves from the world outside. Some larger brothels even offered entertainment, dancing, dice games, or songs sung by traveling minstrels. A few in richer cities like Florence or Venice were nearly indistinguishable from small inns or bathhouses. Rooms and furniture. Upstairs, the rooms were small, sometimes no bigger than a pantry. Low ceilings, plastered walls, wooden shutters, and rushes on the floor. Beds were simple, a straw mattress or feathers if fortune smiled, covered with linen sheets that were washed. Occasionally, a small table held a candle, a bowl of water, and maybe a sprig of lavender to freshen the air. In wealthier establishments, you might find embroidered hangings, cushions, or colored drapes. But even these were modest compared to the grand chambers of nobles. Still, to the people who lived and worked there, these rooms were home, filled with laughter, whispers, and the occasional sound of singing drifting through the thin wooden walls. Light and shadow. Candles and oil lamps provided the only light, soft, golden, and alive with movement. The flicker of the flame made every surface shimmer, every shadow dance. In that dim glow, the world outside, the sermons, the markets, the endless toil, seemed far away. Inside, there was only warmth, the hum of quiet conversation, and the gentle rhythm of the fire. You can almost hear it, can't you? The murmur of voices, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of a world that somehow found rest between sin and survival, hygiene and realities. Now, let's not idealize it too much. Medieval brothels weren't spas. Clean water was a luxury. Soap was expensive. Bathing, though practiced, was not exactly daily. But the houses often kept herbs like sage, rosemary, and lavender, hung from beams to keep away insects and, perhaps, guilt. Some even burned incense, a practice borrowed from churches, oddly enough. Many brothels had a washroom or bath space, sometimes a wooden tub near the hearth, sometimes a shared one in a separate chamber. In southern Europe, especially Italy, these bathhouses were integral, where one could soak, talk, and socialize long before anything else occurred. So yes, if you ever wanted to visit a medieval brothel purely for a warm bath, that was entirely acceptable. At least, officially. The sounds of the night. As evening deepened, the district would come alive. Softly, not loudly. Laughter, footsteps, maybe the faint pluck of a lute. Dogs barked, shutters closed, and the night watchman passed by, pretending not to look. Inside, people from all walks of life gathered. Traveling merchants, soldiers, scribes, and the occasional local noble in disguise. They shared ale, gossiped about wars and kings, and for a few hours the world's hierarchies dissolved. There was something strangely democratic about it all. Everyone equal under candlelight, between comfort and sadness. Still, not every night was cheerful. Some houses were poor, cold, and lonely. For every moment of laughter, there were sighs of exhaustion and faces turned toward the window, staring at the moon. Many women in these houses dreamed of leaving, saving enough to start anew. Perhaps as laundresses, innkeepers, or wives. Others had nowhere else to go. And yet, through it all, they created a sense of community. Small acts of kindness in dimly lit rooms, laughter that defied sorrow, and a shared humanity that history often forgets. So, when we think of medieval brothels, we shouldn't imagine wild luxury or moral ruin. They were, more often, places of survival, ordinary homes turned into small worlds of escape. Wooden walls holding countless untold stories. As the candle burns lower and the fire fades, you can almost picture the quiet stillness, the whisper of the wind through the shutters, and the slow rhythm of a city falling asleep. Chapter 4. The Women of the Trade. Behind every candlelit window, behind the laughter and the rustling of skirts, were real women. Complex, funny, tired, hopeful, and human. The women of the medieval brothel have often been reduced to whispers in history, footnotes between laws and sermons. But tonight, we'll let them step quietly into the light, just long enough to understand who they really were. Who they were. Most of these women didn't set out to work in brothels. They came from every corner of society's lower ranks. Farmers' daughters, widows, orphans, sometimes even displaced townsfolk or servants who had lost their positions. In an age when women's options were painfully limited, this trade, for all its stigma, offered survival. It was dangerous, yes, but it also provided food, shelter, and a small measure of independence. A woman who worked in a brothel could earn her own coin, make her own choices within a narrow window, and sometimes even save enough to change her future. A few, rare but real, left the life behind and became tavern keepers or midwives. Others, sadly, stayed until the years took their toll. The rules they lived by. Every city had its own regulations. In London, women of the Southwark district were forbidden from dressing like honest wives. They had to wear striped hoods or special badges. In Paris, they were not allowed to attend public dances unless invited by a respectable man. In Florence, they could not live outside designated streets and had curfews enforced by city guards. Life, even in a trade built on freedom from rules, was still full of rules. Brothel keepers enforced curfews, cleanliness, and behavior codes. Arguments were fined. Drunkenness was discouraged. Even laughter was supposed to stay moderate, Apparently, the medieval world didn't like excessive cheer, clothing, and appearance. There was an odd irony in how the authorities demanded these women remain visible and invisible at the same time. They couldn't wear fine fabrics, no silk or fur, but they were often encouraged to look attractive enough to draw customers. So they wore bright colors made from cheaper dyes, reds, yellows, and oranges, hues considered earthy or sinful. Hair was often worn uncovered, unlike the respectable married women who veiled theirs. Jewelry, if any, was simple. Glass beads, copper rings, or small trinkets traded from travelers. To the passing eye, they were a flash of color in a gray city, vivid but untouchable. The daily routine. A typical day began late. In the morning, the women might rest, wash clothes, or help with cooking. Some would visit the market, veiled or hooded, to buy bread or candles. Afternoons were quiet, filled with gossip, sewing, or mending garments. The nights were for work, when the city darkened and the candlelight took over. Meals were simple but shared. Stew, bread, ale, and sometimes a small sweet, a reminder of comfort. Many brothels functioned like families, with women caring for each other in sickness and sharing their meager earnings when times were hard. There was laughter, too, genuine despite everything. Inside those dimly lit rooms, jokes were told, songs were sung, and occasionally, someone would dance barefoot on the wooden floor just for the joy of it. Their humanity in a harsh world. Life for these women was rarely safe. The medieval world could be cruel both in disease and in judgment, but they built small circles of solidarity, helping one another when the world wouldn't. They protected newcomers, warned each other of bad customers, and sometimes pooled money for a friend's freedom or medical care. Records show instances where these women collectively refused service to violent or unfair patrons, quiet acts of rebellion that echo through time. And in rare moments, their kindness touched even those who scorned them. Chroniclers tell of prostitutes tending to the sick during plague years, when no one else dared to. In their own quiet way, they showed that compassion can bloom even in the most forgotten corners. The view from the church. The church, of course, condemned the trade, yet priests and bishops often acknowledged its persistence. Some women sought forgiveness later in life, joining convents or becoming caregivers. In cities like Venice and Avignon, there were even charitable houses where former workers could retire or repent, the medieval version of a second chance. But not all sought redemption. Some simply wanted peace, anonymity, and a little dignity in a world that rarely offered it. The humor of survival. Despite everything, humor was their greatest armor. There are accounts of women joking with guards, teasing priests, and inventing nicknames for self-important officials. They understood life better than most, that people were flawed, that holiness and hypocrisy often shared a street, and that laughter was sometimes the only form of rebellion left. It's easy to imagine them on a quiet night, sitting by the window, sharing stories about foolish customers or strange dreams, and laughing softly until the candle burned low. Their legacy. Though history rarely records their names, these women were part of the very heartbeat of medieval cities. They carried stories, gossip, and truths from one world to another. They were witnesses to everything, the lives of merchants, knights, monks, and beggars alike. And while many suffered, they also lived fully, defiant, humorous, and deeply human. They remind us that history isn't just kings and wars. It's also the quiet endurance of ordinary souls in extraordinary circumstances. So tonight, as we close this chapter, picture a quiet corner of a medieval town. A woman sitting by her window, a candle burning beside her, and the hum of the street below fading into night. Her story, like so many others, lingers in the silence. Chapter 5: The Business Side. For all their moral debates, medieval cities were surprisingly practical when it came to business. And yes, even brothels, or as the polite documents called them, public houses of women, ran like small, well-managed enterprises. Behind every flickering candle and whispered conversation, there were ledgers, taxes, rent, and rules. Because even sin in the Middle Ages had an accountant. The economics of desire. Let's start with the basics: money. In a world where most laborers earned only a few pence a day, the brothel economy was both humble and essential. The average cost of services varied depending on the city, the wealth of the customer, and the quality of the establishment. In Paris, records from the 14th century suggest a visit could cost between 2 and 6 deniers, roughly what a craftsman might earn in a single day. It wasn't luxury, it was affordable escapism for the working class. For richer patrons, knights, merchants, or the occasional young noble studying in town, the price rose. But always within reason. Medieval capitalism, it seems, knew its customer base. The role of the brothel keeper. At the center of it all was the brothel keeper, usually an older woman or a widow, known by many names: abbess, hostess, landlady of love. Her duties were far more administrative than romantic. She maintained order, kept track of earnings, handled disputes, and ensured the city taxes were paid on time. In many towns, she held an official license, often sealed by the local authority or bishop. She had to ensure her house stayed clean, quiet, and free of scandal, which is a remarkable thing to promise, considering the line of work. Rent, fees, and taxes. Everything was regulated and taxed. Women paid rent for their rooms, fees for food and candles, and a small portion of their income to the keeper. The keeper then paid a city tax, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, depending on the town's level of moral enthusiasm. In Southwark, for example, the Bishop of Winchester's officials collected taxes known as the goose rent, named after the local slang Winchester geese, for the women who worked there. Yes, the church quite literally made money from what it condemned. Hypocrisy, it seems, was not invented in modern times. Competition and creativity. Brothel owners had to be clever. Competition was fierce, and since advertising was frowned upon, they used creativity to attract customers. Some hired musicians to play near the doorway. Others decorated their signs with flowers, or used scented herbs to draw attention. One record from Florence even describes a brothel offering complimentary wine for regular guests. Medieval marketing at its finest. In busier districts, houses competed for location. Closer to taverns, markets, or docks meant steady business. Sailors, merchants, and pilgrims made excellent, if transient, customers. A web of related trades. Brothels didn't exist in isolation. They were woven into the urban economy like any other enterprise. Taverns supplied their ale. Bakers delivered bread. Laundresses washed linens. And tailors stitched bright dresses that could be spotted even in the dim candlelight. Sometimes, brothels shared walls or courtyards with bathhouses, turning the combination into a kind of medieval spa experience. One could have a bath, a drink, and a conversation all in the same building. You could call it the 14th century version of dinner and a show, the bookkeeping of vice. Brothel ledgers, yes, some actually survive, show surprising levels of organization. Entries included the names of workers, lists of customers, supply purchases, and debts owed. In Venice, some keepers recorded the costs of perfumes, candles, musical instruments, and even small pets. Cats were popular for keeping vermin away and for company. Profits weren't massive, but steady. In a world of uncertainty, that counted for something. The city's cut. City authorities didn't just tolerate brothels. They relied on them financially. The taxes from public houses went into civic funds used for infrastructure, bridges, roads, and even church repairs. It was an unspoken but practical partnership between virtue and vice. And so, even as sermons thundered against immorality, Masons quietly built cathedrals using coins earned from the very thing those sermons condemned. The medieval world, as ever, was full of irony. The business hierarchy. Not all houses were equal. At the bottom were small, shabby establishments. 1 or 2 rooms, candlelight barely bright enough to read by. At the top were large, semi-official houses near major streets, sometimes with multiple employees, guards, musicians, and servants. A few even had menus of sorts, lists of available entertainments or drinks, though not written down openly. The wealthiest houses were closer to taverns or private clubs, serving local elites in secret. But even those could vanish overnight if city morals shifted or the plague rolled through. The risk of the trade. It wasn't all steady profit, of course. Wars, famine, or disease could devastate business. And during outbreaks like the Black Death, brothels were among the first to close, not out of morality but necessity. Many women found themselves destitute again, turning to begging or domestic service to survive. Still, some brothels adapted, shifting to small private rooms or moving outside city walls. Wherever there were people, there was business, after all. The economic irony. It's easy to laugh gently at the idea of medieval bureaucracy trying to manage sin like a trade, but in many ways it worked. By regulating and taxing vice, cities maintained order, reduced violence, and filled their treasuries. It was, in a twisted way, social control through bookkeeping. And though it seems strange now, this system kept peace between the church, the state, and the streets, a truce between morality and money. As the city sleeps, the coin boxes are locked, candles extinguished, and the night returns to silence. Somewhere, a brothel keeper counts the day's earnings, sighs, and places her ledger beside the bed, the softest sound in the stillness of medieval commerce. Chapter 6: Morality, Religion, and Double Standards. The Middle Ages were a time of grand cathedrals, solemn prayers, and, just around the corner, candlelit brothels. The two worlds coexisted awkwardly, like roommates who refused to make eye contact but shared the same kitchen. It was a society where sin was inevitable, forgiveness was profitable, and morality was, well, flexible. The church's official stance? Absolutely not. The church's position on prostitution was crystal clear. It was sinful, deeply sinful. Sermons thundered about it. Priests warned of eternal damnation, and confessionals were filled with guilty whispers. But, and this is the truly medieval twist, the church also accepted that prostitution was necessary. St. Augustine, one of the great thinkers of early Christianity, once argued that removing prostitution from society would be like removing the sewer from a palace. The whole building would overflow. In other words, it was better to have sin contained in one place rather than spilling everywhere. A practical, if not exactly holy, argument. Sin as a public service. Many medieval theologians viewed brothels as a grim but useful outlet, protecting honest women from temptation and keeping order among men. So, in some cities, the church didn't just tolerate prostitution, it helped regulate it. Brothels were moved to certain districts, often under church jurisdiction. In Avignon, the papal city itself, The local brothel operated just across the river from the Pope's palace. The irony is so thick it could be spread on bread. Confession and contradiction. For the women who worked in these houses, life was full of moral whiplash. They were sinners, publicly shamed, forced to live in separate quarters, and often forbidden to enter churches except during special services. But they were also forgivable. Many confessors and friars visited brothel districts not to condemn, but to preach, offer blessings, or encourage reform. Some women later joined convents, becoming living proof of repentance. One might say the church offered both the sin and the salvation, a one-stop shop for the medieval soul. Moral policing and public shaming. Cities developed elaborate systems of moral control. Women were required to wear distinctive clothing, yellow hoods, striped dresses, or specific badges, marking them as fallen. This was meant to prevent honest citizens from mistaking them for respectable wives or daughters. But it also made them targets for mockery and exclusion. Yet, in a strange twist, some women wore their distinctive colors with pride, turning the mark of shame into a symbol of independence. It was perhaps the first quiet rebellion of fashion. The role of the preachers. Medieval preachers loved to use prostitution as a metaphor for moral decay. It made for vivid, dramatic sermons. They compared the sinful city to a brothel, or the greedy merchant to a man selling his soul for flesh. And the audience listened, nodded, and then went home, often walking past the same establishments the preacher warned against. The dissonance was impressive. Still, the message stuck. Sin was part of life, but one must acknowledge it, confess it, and then probably do it again next week. Religious orders and strange compromises. Some religious institutions had even stranger arrangements. In parts of Germany and Italy, city-run brothels were technically owned by the church or rented from monastic lands. Monks would collect rent without ever mentioning what the property was used for. Records from constant show payments made directly to church treasuries labeled simply as "from the women's house." That was apparently enough detail for everyone. It was a delicate dance, moral outrage on Sundays, bookkeeping on Mondays. The fallen but forgiven narrative. Medieval literature often portrayed prostitutes as tragic but redeemable. In miracle stories, the sinful woman repents, becomes a nun, and sometimes even a saint. Mary Magdalene, long and wrongly depicted as a prostitute, became the ultimate symbol of divine forgiveness. Artists loved this theme. Paintings showed her weeping, her hair loose, eyes lifted to heaven, beauty wrapped in guilt and grace. It was both moral lesson and emotional comfort. Anyone could fall, and anyone could rise again. Double standards everywhere. For all the moral talk, men were rarely punished for visiting brothels. It was seen as a male weakness, not a crime. Women, on the other hand, carried the full burden of shame. They could lose their homes, their families, even their burial rights in consecrated ground. A man's sin was forgiven in confession. A woman's sin was worn like a badge. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle, but it was socially accepted. The language of sin. Even the language reflected this imbalance. A woman could be called a fallen soul, harlot, loose creature, or public woman. Men, meanwhile, were described as tempted, youthful, or simply worldly. The medieval dictionary was not fair, but it did reveal what society valued: control, appearance, and the careful balancing of desire and virtue. Redemption in the margins. Not all stories ended in tragedy. Some women used their earnings to buy homes, help their families, or retire early. A few left money to churches or hospitals in their wills, perhaps seeking peace in the afterlife. There are records of priests conducting funerals for former sex workers, praying for their souls with quiet respect. And in those small acts of compassion, the harshness of medieval morality softened, if only a little. The eternal paradox. The Middle Ages were built on contradiction, between piety and passion, between sin and structure. The Church thundered against desire, yet lived alongside it. Brothels were denounced as houses of the devil, yet funded bridges and fed the poor. Women were condemned as sinners, yet celebrated as symbols of redemption. It was messy, human, and entirely medieval. As bells rang for vespers and the streets emptied, the brothel's lanterns flickered quietly in the dark, a reminder that even in the most devout of ages, desire found its place. Chapter 7. Inside the walls, daily life and routines. If you could step quietly into a medieval brothel, say somewhere in 14th century London, Paris, or Venice, you might be surprised by how ordinary it felt. Sure, there was laughter, perfume, and candlelight, but beneath the glitter, it was a workplace like any other, with schedules, cleaning duties, meal times, and more rules than anyone expected. Think less wild revelry and more organized chaos with a house cat. The morning after the night before, the day began late. When the rest of the city was opening shop or heading to mass, brothels were just beginning to stir. The shutters creaked open to let in the pale daylight. The smell of last night's candles, wine, and rushes mixed with the scent of soap and baking bread from nearby kitchens. Women washed themselves and their rooms. Fresh water carried in buckets, sheets shaken out, straw replaced on the floors. Everything had to be tidy. The city inspectors could visit at any time, and fines for uncleanliness were steep. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Breakfast and gossip. Breakfast was simple. Coarse bread, maybe cheese, sometimes watered-down wine or ale. Food was communal, often provided by the brothel keeper, who deducted its cost from everyone's earnings. Mornings were for small chores, mending dresses, or gossiping about clients, rivals, and city rumors. It was a rare time of quiet camaraderie, a few stolen hours of normalcy before the performance began again. In some larger houses, a hired servant or maid handled cleaning and errands. But in smaller ones, everyone pitched in. There was an unspoken rhythm: work, rest, survival, repeat, dressing for the night. As afternoon shadows grew longer, preparations began. Clothing was everything. The law might restrict colors, no silks or rich reds, but women found ways to stand out. Bright ribbons, cheap jewelry, flowers in the hair, anything to catch the candlelight. In some cities like Venice and Avignon, women in brothels wore yellow, a color of both shame and distinction. But within those walls, it became a uniform of independence. A little rouge from crushed berries, a spritz of rosewater if one could afford it, and the transformation was complete. It was theater, in a way, each woman stepping into a role, one that balanced charm, wit, and endurance. The evening rush. The busiest hours came after sunset. Candles flickered to life, musicians played softly, and voices drifted through the open shutters. Customers came in twos and threes, sailors from the docks, apprentices with their week's pay, weary merchants, even the occasional priest in disguise. The brothel keeper managed the flow, settled payments, and made sure things stayed orderly. Fights were bad for business, and the city watch didn't need another excuse to raid. In many towns, curfews existed, The doors had to be closed by a certain hour, though this rule was flexible. As long as the neighbors didn't complain too loudly, life went on. The rooms themselves were small and functional. A bed stuffed with straw, a wooden chest, a small table for a candle, and perhaps a tapestry or two if the house was doing well. Walls were often covered with fabric or painted scenes, not for decoration, but for warmth and privacy. Sometimes, rushes or herbs were scattered on the floor to mask the smell, lavender, thyme, or sweet woodruff if you were lucky. In winter, the cold was bone deep. In summer, the air hung thick with heat and candle smoke. And yet, amid all that, life carried on. The same rituals, the same laughter, the same whispered jokes. The clients, they came from all walks of life. Laborers seeking comfort, travelers passing through, even nobles testing their anonymity. Each had a story, and many shared them. For some women, their clients were the only source of conversation outside the house. The talk could be surprisingly gentle. Dreams, regrets, and news from distant towns. It wasn't always about lust. Sometimes it was about loneliness. One Venetian record mentions a woman who kept a small notebook of her clients' names and stories, not for blackmail, but because she enjoyed their tales. An early example, perhaps, of medieval therapy. The house rules. Every brothel had rules, often written, sometimes memorized. Common ones included no fighting among the women, no stealing from clients, no clients after curfew bells, no refusing city officials or tax collectors. That one was non-negotiable. And perhaps most importantly, always pay your share to the keeper. Breaking these rules could mean fines, expulsion, or worse. Discipline kept the fragile peace. Entertainment beyond the obvious. Contrary to popular myth, medieval brothels weren't just about the main business. Some offered music, dice games, storytelling, even food and drink. Men came to talk, play, and unwind, like a medieval version of a club, just with fewer chairs. Women often learned songs or witty conversation to charm their guests. Laughter, as much as beauty, was part of the trade. And sometimes, after all the noise, there were long, quiet moments. Two people sitting by candlelight, sharing warmth in the cold. Illness and cures. Of course, there were dangers. Disease was an ever-present shadow. The term the French disease, or the Great Pox, what we now know as syphilis, spread rapidly through Europe by the 15th century. Before that, older ailments, rashes, fevers, infections were common. Cures ranged from herbal ointments to terrifying mixtures involving mercury. Still, some women took surprising precautions. Washing in vinegar, boiling linens, and using herbal rinses. For their time, they were pioneers in basic hygiene. The bonds of sisterhood. Within these walls, friendships formed, sometimes stronger than those found in convents or noble courts. They shared earnings, secrets, and warnings about troublesome clients. They protected each other when tempers flared or when sickness struck. There were quarrels, of course, jealousy, exhaustion, heartbreak. But beneath it all was a sense of solidarity born from shared struggle. The world outside judged them harshly. Inside, they built their own kind of community. The quiet hours. As night faded, the laughter dimmed. The last candle sputtered. The musicians packed away their lutes, and the women retreated to their small beds. The city outside slept, the taverns empty, the watchmen yawning under flickering torches. Inside, someone whispered a prayer. Another counted coins. Another stared quietly at the ceiling, wondering what tomorrow would bring. For all the talk of sin and scandal, most nights ended like any other, with exhaustion, reflection, and a little hope for better luck. The morning again, and then morning again, a yawn, a stretch, a splash of cold water. The shutters open, light spills across the straw floors, and the cycle continues. Work, rest, survival. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life. And within those walls, amid laughter, sorrow, and song, they carved out a space for themselves. A small, candlelit corner of the medieval world that history too often forgets. Chapter 8. Famous brothels and scandals across Europe. Every medieval city had its secrets. The quiet streets where candles glowed a little longer. The houses where laughter didn't stop until dawn. Some of these places became so infamous they slipped into official records, literature, and rumor alike. They weren't just houses of sin. They were landmarks of human contradiction, tolerated, taxed, and occasionally toasted. Let's wander through a few. London, the stews of Southwark. Across the River Thames, in the shadow of St. Paul's, lay the Bankside Stews, London's licensed brothel district. The word stew originally meant bathhouse, but over time those warm waters led to, well, warmer activities. By the 14th century, Southwark's brothels were under the authority of the Bishop of Winchester himself. Yes, the church literally owned them. The women working there were mockingly called Winchester geese. It was an oddly respectable business arrangement. The bishop collected rent and taxes, the city kept order, and everyone pretended this was a necessary evil for the sake of social harmony. There were rules, of course. No married women allowed. No clergy permitted, officially. No one after curfew. Naturally, all of those rules were broken regularly. Even Shakespeare's contemporaries joked about it. The stews appear in poems, plays, and city records alike. A blend of vice and bureaucracy that only medieval England could produce. Paris, the maison closes of the Seine. If London was practical, Paris was theatrical. By the late 13th century, the city had entire districts known for brothels, the Rue du Champfleury, Rue de Lombards, and the site near Notre Dame. Here, houses were more ornate, often doubling as taverns or inns. Music, dancing, and conversation blurred the line between entertainment and intimacy. The Parisian authorities, ever organized, issued licenses to public women, and even designated official madams. These women paid taxes, kept records, and were expected to maintain decorum. A strange word to use for their trade, but there it was, written in law. One of the most famous, La Pucelle d'Orleans, was run by a woman known for her sharp wit and unflappable sense of humor. Chroniclers mention she entertained nobles, poets, and occasionally clergy, always with discretion and a fine Bordeaux. Paris, as ever, made sin into art. Venice, the floating temptation. Venice, that shimmering city on water, had a long, complicated affair with vice. By the 14th century, it was one of Europe's most cosmopolitan ports, full of sailors, traders, and foreign diplomats. Naturally, brothels thrived. But because space was limited, some were built on boats and barges, floating quietly in the lagoon. Visitors were ferried out by gondola, where candlelight flickered across the waves and laughter echoed softly under the stars. Venetian authorities alternated between banning and taxing them, depending on how empty the treasury was. There's even record of a floating brothel nicknamed the House of Mirrors for its glittering decor, part illusion, part reflection of Venice itself. Beautiful, decadent, and slightly dangerous. Florence, beauty and scandal. Florence tried to ban prostitution entirely several times. It failed every single time. By the 15th century, there were dozens of small, discreet brothels tucked behind workshops and near markets. They attracted everyone from artists' apprentices to wealthy patrons. Some scholars suggest that artists like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, both known for their fascination with beauty and anatomy, may have drawn inspiration from these districts. Sketches of women from that era show faces that seem half angelic, half mischievous, perhaps modeled after real muses of Florence's hidden quarters. And of course, the city's notorious Medici rulers quietly tolerated it. After all, keeping the population content was part of good governance. Avignon, the Pope's neighborhood. Nothing says medieval contradiction like Avignon in the 14th century. While the popes resided there, the city became both a center of faith and a hotspot of vice. The Rue de Teinturiers, Street of the Dyers, was famous for its brothels, located mere minutes from the papal palace. Pilgrims, merchants, and priests all mingled after sunset. When moral panic erupted, the church would order temporary closures, usually for Lent or public scandal. But as soon as the celebrations ended, the houses reopened, sometimes under new names and new madams. Avignon proved that even holiness could have a very lively neighborhood. Nuremberg and the German Frauenhäuser. In the Holy Roman Empire, many cities created official brothels called Frauenhäuser, or women's houses. They were run by the city council itself. Imagine a municipal department of controlled debauchery. Nuremberg's Frauenhaus was perhaps the most famous, complete with guards, curfews, and tax books. Women were registered, inspected for health, and required to live on the premises. It was coldly efficient, a mix of social control, moral management, and financial pragmatism. But records also show that the women themselves developed communities, saving money together, and even forming small guild-like groups for mutual aid. A strange blend of bureaucracy and sisterhood. Spain, Seville's Casas de Mancebia. In Spain, particularly in Seville, prostitution was heavily regulated under the term mancebia, a designated district where brothels were legal. These areas were carefully separated from decent society, walled off or marked by gates. Yet they thrived, especially during festivals and trade fairs. Spanish literature of the 15th century often set comedies and tales in these places, full of wit, wordplay, and irony about men who preached purity but practiced otherwise. It was a reminder that humor has always been history's coping mechanism. The scandals. Every now and then, a scandal broke that sent the moral authorities into a frenzy. In Paris, a nobleman's affair with a courtesan led to a city-wide investigation into corrupting influences. The brothel was shut down and reopened 2 weeks later under a new name. In London, a group of priests caught in the stews caused such outrage that Parliament briefly tried to close all brothels, a law that lasted less than a year. And in Venice, a nobleman's son eloped with a courtesan, sparking a family feud so fierce it inspired local ballads. Each scandal faded, replaced by new gossip, new sermons, and new customers. The rhythm of contradiction continued, as steady as the tolling of church bells. When the curtain fell, by the late 15th and 16th centuries, things began to change. The Renaissance brought new ideas about virtue, the body, and disease. Reformers like Martin Luther condemned the brothel system, and many cities began closing them permanently. What had once been tolerated became taboo. But for centuries before, these places were part of everyday life, woven into the city's fabric, financed by kings, taxed by bishops, and immortalized by poets. They remind us that medieval life was never just black and white. It was candlelight and shadow, laughter and confession, sin and survival. As night deepens in our journey, we leave behind the bustling streets and the echo of soft music across the canals. The scandals fade into legend, and the brothel doors close quietly on history's most human stories. Chapter 9. The women themselves, a voices lost and found. History rarely gives these women names. Records call them public women, fallen, or unfortunate souls. But behind those bland words were thousands of individual lives. Clever, weary, brave, and complicated. They weren't just symbols of sin or shame. They were survivors in a world that gave them few choices and little mercy. So tonight, we open those faded pages and listen, softly, for their stories. Who were they? Most came from poverty. Some were daughters of peasants or artisans who lost their families to famine or plague. Others were orphans, widows, or women abandoned by lovers who promised marriage and vanished with the morning. In an age when women had almost no legal rights, work options were painfully limited. A woman without family or dowry could be a laundress, a servant, a spinner, or, if those failed, a public woman. For some, it was a last resort. For others, strangely enough, it was a way to earn independence. Inside the brothel, at least, she had food, shelter, and a bit of coin she could call her own. A day in her life. From dawn's dim light to midnight's final whispers, her world was full of repetition and risk. She cleaned, she dressed, she smiled. Some nights were kind, others cruel. There were good customers who treated her with warmth, and others who saw her as nothing but a shadow. She learned to read moods, the difference between laughter that meant safety and silence that meant danger. Yet, amid all this, there were moments of softness. Jokes shared with the other women, songs hummed while washing hair, small gifts from regulars who became friends. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was life, health, hope, and hardship. Illness was constant, not just from disease, but from exhaustion, cold, and hunger. The air inside many brothels was heavy with smoke and damp. The beds shared, the windows shuttered tight. Yet even here, resilience shone through. Some women became skilled healers, mixing herbs to soothe burns, bruises, and fevers. Others saved money in secret, hiding coins under floorboards or behind loose stones. A few bought their freedom entirely, opening taverns or laundry houses of their own. And some, those whose beauty or charm caught the eye of the powerful, rose higher still. The courtesans, the rare few who ruled their world. In the upper tiers of this trade were the courtesans, educated, witty, and influential women who blurred the line between entertainer and intellectual. They dressed in fine silks, quoted poetry, and discussed philosophy with princes and popes. Figures like Veronica Franco in Venice became poets, published authors, and even political figures, though they still carried the stigma of their profession. They wrote about love, hypocrisy, and the dignity of women. Franco once said, "We are not the sin others name us. We are the mirror they fear to see themselves in." It was one of the bravest statements of her time. But for every Veronica Franco, there were thousands whose stories were never written. The forgotten names. Court records preserve a few fragments. Agnes of Bath, fined for keeping company near the churchyard. Marion the Gold, expelled for refusing to wear the yellow hood of her trade. Beatrix of Cologne, who left her small savings to an orphanage for girls who have no one. Each line in the record feels like a whisper through stone walls, proof that they lived, worked, and cared for others despite everything. the weight of stigma. No matter how kind or skilled, society rarely forgave them. They were denied church burial, excluded from guilds, and often barred from marrying within their community. Even after leaving the trade, their reputation followed them like a shadow. But in private letters and wills, traces of kindness appear. A local baker forgiving a debt, a priest allowing a burial at dawn, a friend writing simply, "She was a good woman." Small mercies, buried between the lines of official history, their quiet rebellions. Though many lived under strict control, these women found subtle ways to push back. They mocked city inspectors behind their backs. They sewed secret patterns into their dresses, charms of protection and defiance. They formed friendships that defied the idea that they were alone or immoral. And sometimes they simply refused to be silent. In one remarkable 15th century document from Bruges, a group of women petitioned the city council for better conditions and protection from violence. Their argument was simple: we work for the city's peace. The city should not work against us. A bold, forgotten act of proto-feminism centuries ahead of its time. Love and longing. It might surprise you, but many found love, real, fragile love, amid their work. There are accounts of clients who returned not for pleasure, but companionship, of women who married former patrons or guards, leaving the trade behind. And even in places where marriage was forbidden, they wrote letters, exchanged tokens, whispered vows not recognized by any church, but binding in their own hearts. Because even surrounded by transaction, they still believed in affection. That perhaps was their quietest rebellion of all. Their legacy, when brothels closed, when reforms swept across Europe, when the sermons silenced the laughter, their stories almost disappeared. But their presence lingered, in the art, in the literature, in the words and customs that survived. They were part of the medieval city's lifeblood, its economy, its secrets, its humanity. And though history called them fallen, they were, in truth, pillars of survival in a hard, uneven world. The final thought: if you could walk through a medieval city at night and listen closely, you might still hear echoes, laughter from behind shutters, a song rising above the hum of the streets. They were never the villains of their story. They were simply women doing what they had to do, in the only ways the world allowed. And even now, across the centuries, their quiet courage deserves remembrance. Chapter 10. The End of the Medieval Brothel Era, Reforms and Decline. Every age believes it is permanent, that its streets, its sounds, its customs will last forever. But the candles of the medieval world began to flicker. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the once tolerated brothels that stood proudly on city corners were beginning to vanish. Their decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow unraveling, like a tapestry fraying at the edges. The changing air of the Renaissance. A new world was dawning. The medieval belief in divine order and earthly sin was giving way to the sharper moral clarity of the Renaissance and the Reformation. Cities were growing wealthier, cleaner, more regulated. And as merchants replaced knights and bureaucrats replaced bishops, the old licensed sins became inconvenient reminders of a Messier past. Where once a brothel was seen as a necessary evil, now it was viewed as an unnecessary embarrassment. Reformers, both religious and civic, began to speak of purity, decency, and public health. The same cities that had once collected taxes from these houses now began closing them, one by one. The Black Death's shadow. Long before reformers took the moral high ground, nature had already done its own kind of cleansing. The plague, that silent, invisible reaper, struck Europe again and again through the 14th century. And with it came fear. Crowded quarters, bathhouses, and brothels were suddenly seen as dangerous places where disease festered. Municipal records from cities like Florence, Paris, and London began using the word contagion, not just for sickness, but for sin. Brothels were shuttered, fumigated, sometimes even burned. And though many reopened when the panic faded, they never returned to their former prominence. The rise of moral reform. By the 15th century, voices of reform were everywhere. Preachers like Savonarola thundered against vice in Florence, urging citizens to cast out temptation and return to purity. Public bonfires of vanity burned cosmetics, love poems, and clothing once worn by the city's entertainers. In Germany, city councils began to declare that brothels were the devil's schools. In England, King Henry VIII, never a model of restraint himself, eventually banned London's Southwark stews, citing infection of the body and corruption of the soul. The irony was not lost on his people. The Reformation, faith and fear. When the Protestant Reformation swept across Europe, it didn't just change religion. It reshaped how society viewed sin itself. Protestant reformers saw vice as a matter of personal moral weakness rather than a practical inevitability. To tolerate brothels, they argued, was to tolerate sin itself. Cities that once managed brothels as civic institutions, collecting rent, maintaining order, now condemned them as relics of corruption. By the mid-16th century, official brothels were outlawed in most of Western Europe. Only a few southern cities, like Venice, held on to their regulated casini or bathhouses, and even there, the golden age was fading fast. What came after? Of course, closing brothels didn't end the trade. It merely pushed it into the shadows. Where once the women worked under license and some degree of safety, they now faced harsher risks: secrecy, illegality, and punishment. Ironically, the attempt to purify the cities often made life more dangerous for the very people reformers claimed to protect. The story repeats across centuries. Law replaces tolerance, morality replaces management, and reality continues quietly beneath both. The ghosts of old streets. Walk through London's Bankside today, or along Paris's Rue Saint-Denis, and you can still feel the faint pulse of that past. Many of the old buildings are gone, but the street names, the layout, even the way some neighborhoods feel after dark, they carry echoes of their history. Archaeologists have found trinkets, coins, perfume bottles, even fragments of wooden signs. Small, fragile reminders of a world once half hidden and half celebrated. The laughter and music are gone, but the stones remember. The modern legacy. It's strange, what once was tolerated and then condemned now becomes the subject of academic papers, museum exhibits, and documentaries. We study what our ancestors feared. We talk calmly about what they whispered about in secret. And in a way, that's a kind of redemption. Because by remembering, by understanding, we give voice to those who had none. A gentle reflection. When you think about the medieval brothel, it's easy to imagine sin, secrecy, or scandal. But perhaps the truer image is one of survival, of ordinary people living within the rules and contradictions of their time. They were part of a city's rhythm, the noise, the work, the dreams, and the despair. When those candles went out, it wasn't just the end of vice. It was the end of an entire way of seeing the world. A time when sin was something you could regulate, inspect, and even tax. The new world that rose in its place would be stricter, cleaner, more moral, but perhaps also a little less human. Crescent moon closing the chapter. And so, the story of medieval brothels fades quietly into the night, not with a scandal, but with a sigh. They were strange, contradictory places, both condemned and protected, shunned and necessary. Their walls are gone, their laughter long silent, but the history they left behind still flickers, a reminder that even the most forgotten corners of the past have something to teach us about what it means to be human. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the candlelit corners of the medieval world. If you enjoyed this calm dive into history, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the Deep Sleep Library. Your support helps keep the stories alive, the quiet, strange, and sleepy corners of the past where we can all wander before we dream. And if you'd like to keep drifting through time, check out our other videos from ancient Rome to the mysteries of the Victorian era. Because every age has its secrets, and every secret has a story worth telling. Good night, traveler, and may your dreams be gentle and your history endless.